The rose you pressed inside my Bible. You pressed the rose inside my Bible the day you said goodbye. And for 63 years, I have not turned that page. I was afraid that if I touched it, the memory of you might finally crumble into dust. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, dust drifting lazily in the air of the small, cluttered room. Henry Whitaker sat in his worn armchair, a wool blanket wrapped around his legs, the Bible resting gently on his lap. His hands trembled as he traced the leather cover with the care of someone handling a fragile relic, though it was not the book itself he feared to damage. It was the rose. Tucked away on page 637 of the Book of Psalms, the rose had been pressed there by Eleanor, his wife, 63 years earlier, on the morning she left for the hospital and never came home. A single petal peeked out from the edge of the page, still faintly red, the color of a love that refused to fade. Henry had never looked at it since. Someday, he often whispered to himself, someday, I'll be strong enough. That someday had not yet come. He reached for the cup of tea beside him, lukewarm and untouched. Rain tapped against the window in a steady rhythm, like the echo of time. Outside, the world went on. Children ran past in yellow slickers. Dogs barked. Car tires hissed on wet pavement. Inside, time had slowed to a crawl. The house was quiet now. His daughter, Lucy, had moved to Chicago years ago. His friends had mostly passed on. There were nurses who came by during the week, checking on his meds and blood pressure, exchanging pleasantries he barely registered. But when they left, the silence filled every corner like fog rolling into a valley. Sometimes, Henry talked to Eleanor, not aloud, just in his mind, where her voice still lived clearly. Do you remember the garden, Ellie? He would think. How you said roses were God's way of smiling. He had not tended the garden since she passed. The bushes were overgrown, the trellis half collapsed, and yet each spring, without fail, the roses bloomed. On this particular morning, a letter had arrived. It was from Lucy, and inside was a photograph. She and her daughter, his granddaughter, were standing on a college campus in caps and gowns. The girl, Sophie, had graduated early, valedictorian. Henry's eyes welled with pride. She looked just like Eleanor. He picked up the phone to call her, but hesitated. What would he say? That he was proud? That he missed her? That the silence here had become too heavy to bear? Instead, he placed the photo beside the Bible and let out a slow, rattling breath. The day passed as it always did. Henry dozed in and out of sleep, the memories rolling in like waves, some gentle, others crashing. He dreamt of Eleanor often. Sometimes she was 25 again, standing in the kitchen with flour on her cheeks, laughing. Other times she was older, in the garden, her hands in the soil, humming hymns. But always, she was smiling. He'd woken crying more times than he could count. That night, a storm came. The wind howled, the house creaked, and thunder cracked the sky open like a whip. Power flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. Henry lit a single candle and held it close as he moved slowly through the hallway, guided more by memory than sight. He paused at the photo of Eleanor hanging above the mantel, her wedding veil barely visible in the sepia tones. I'm still here, he said softly. He returned to his chair, the Bible still unopened on his lap. The flame danced against the walls as he looked down at it, heart pounding. Maybe tonight, he whispered. Maybe it's time. His hand hovered over the page. Page 637. He could feel her there, as though the rose carried the echo of her touch, her breath, her heartbeat. But he did not open it. The next morning came heavy with silence. The power had returned, but Henry hadn't noticed. Something inside him had shifted. He no longer feared the rose would turn to dust if he looked at it. No, now he feared he might. At noon, the doorbell rang. Henry flinched. No one ever rang. He shuffled to the door and opened it to find Sophie standing on the porch, raincoat dripping, cheeks flushed from the cold. Grandpa, she said, smiling. It took a moment for him to speak. Sophie, what are you doing here? She shrugged, her eyes bright. I just needed to see you. I felt, I don't know, like maybe you needed me too. He stepped aside, still stunned. She entered with the energy of youth and the scent of the outside world still clinging to her coat. They sat together in the living room. She looked around, smiling at the familiar clutter. I remember this place so clearly, she said. Everything smells the same. You even kept Grandma's old teacups. Couldn't part with them, he replied. She looked down at the Bible. Is that the one? He nodded. Have you ever opened it? Henry's eyes glistened. Not since the day she left. Sophie leaned in. Maybe it's time. He looked at her, so much like Eleanor it ached. And in that moment, he knew she was right. His hands shook as he opened the Bible. Page by page, they turned, the weight of years pressing down until finally page 637. There it was. The rose, delicate and brittle, its petals pressed flat, the color faded but unmistakable. And beside it a note. A slip of paper he had never known was there. He stared, breath caught. With trembling fingers, he lifted it out and unfolded it. My love, if I don't come back, don't let the garden die. You are the soil in which everything beautiful in me ever bloomed. Keep the roses alive. That way, I'll always be with you. Forever. Eleanor. Henry could not hold back the sob that tore from his chest. Sophie placed her hand on his. I think she waited for you to find that, she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. The years collapsed like paper in the rain, and all that was left was love. That evening, they stood in the overgrown garden. Henry, with Sophie's help, began to prune the wild rose bushes. The thorns tore at his gloves, but he didn't mind. The petals were still red beneath the grime. The soil was good. The roots were strong. And for the first time in over 60 years, Henry felt something growing inside him again. Hope. That night, sleep did not come easily. Henry lay in bed, the scent of rain and earth still on his clothes. The note echoed in his mind, the words dancing like candlelight against the dark. You are the soil in which everything beautiful in me ever bloomed. He repeated them silently, as if saying them enough might bring her back. Sophie stayed in the guest room, the one that used to be Lucy's when she was little. He could hear her moving quietly, probably unpacking or texting friends, or doing whatever it was young people did at night now. The world had changed so much, but love realized had not. At some point, he drifted off, not into deep sleep, but into that soft, blurry space between dreaming and memory. Eleanor was there, barefoot in the garden, her hands brushing rose petals as if each one contained a secret. She turned to him and smiled, not the way she used to when she posed for pictures, but the real smile, the one that lit up her whole face. You opened it, she said. I did, he replied, his voice catching. I was never really gone, Henry. He reached for her, but his hands passed through mist. The garden began to dissolve. No, he murmured. Please stay. He woke with a sharp gasp, the sound of birds outside the window pulling him back into the present. The sky was still gray but brightening, a soft light coating everything in silver. He blinked, sat up slowly, and felt something different. Not lighter, exactly, but cleaner, like the air after a storm. Downstairs, the smell of toast and eggs wafted through the house. He followed it to the kitchen, where Sophie stood at the stove, humming. I hope you like your eggs scrambled, she said without turning around. I do, he said, surprised. Just like your grandma. I know. Mom told me. She turned, holding a steaming plate, and set it gently on the table in front of him. They ate in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence people shared when they knew words were unnecessary. Finally, Henry set down his fork. Thank you for coming. Sophie smiled softly. I think Grandma brought me here. He nodded. I think she did too. She sipped her tea, then asked, will you show me the garden again today? Really show me. He hesitated, then smiled. Yes, we've got some work to do. For the next few hours, they cleared away brambles, pulled up weeds, and untangled the vines that had crept into places they didn't belong. Henry moved slowly but steadily, his muscles stiff but determined. Sophie, young and quick, fetched tools and dug into the earth with enthusiasm. At one point, she stood holding a rose bloom gently in her gloved hand. How did you two meet? She asked, looking at it. Henry chuckled, brushing dirt from his knees. She was the nurse at the VA hospital after I came home from Korea. I was all busted up, inside and out. Most days I didn't even speak. But she never stopped talking. Said if I didn't have words, she had enough for the both of us. And one day you spoke. He smiled, eyes distant. I asked her to marry me. Sophie's eyes widened. Just like that. Just like that. And she said yes. Said she'd been waiting on me to find my voice. The two of them stood still for a long moment, the memory blooming between them like another rose. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Sophie brushed her hands off and looked at the house. Grandpa, yes. Would you ever consider coming to Chicago to live with us? Henry was quiet. I've thought about it. I never wanted to leave her behind. Sophie stepped closer, her voice gentle. But she's not just here. She's in us. In me. In Mom. Maybe the garden isn't only in this backyard. He didn't answer right away. He looked around at the trimmed hedges, the freshly uncovered rose trellis, the open sky. You might be right, he said at last. That night, they lit a fire in the hearth and sat with Coco and old photo albums. Sophie laughed at the old hairstyles, at the wide ties and bell-bottoms, and Henry found himself laughing with her, genuinely, not just out of politeness. Do you know this one? She asked, holding up a photo of Eleanor in a summer dress, dancing barefoot on the grass. She was pregnant with your mother then, he said, smiling at the memory. She said the baby could hear music in the womb. She was beautiful, Sophie whispered. She still is, Henry replied. They fell quiet, the flames crackling. Then Henry turned to her. Would you help me do one more thing tomorrow? Anything. He leaned back. I want to bring some of the roses to her grave. Sophie nodded without hesitation. Of course. The next morning, they trimmed 3 perfect roses, 1 red, 1 pink, and 1 white. Eleanor had once told him the colors meant different things. Red for love, pink for gratitude, white for remembrance. He wrapped the stems in ribbon and placed them gently in a small tin vase. The cemetery was only a mile away, a place he hadn't visited in nearly a year. Not because he didn't care, but because the silence there felt too loud. But today, the silence felt like invitation. They stood by the headstone, the name Eleanor Marie Whitaker etched clean and clear, the words beloved wife and mother beneath it. Henry knelt, his knees aching, and set the roses down. I opened the Bible, he said softly. I read your words. And I'm trying, Ellie. I'm really trying. Sophie stepped beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She'd be proud of you, she whispered. They stayed for a long time. When they returned to the house, Henry went straight to the bookshelf and pulled down a thick, dusty envelope marked Whitaker family photos. He handed it to Sophie. I want you to have these, he said. Sophie blinked. Are you sure? He nodded. I'm ready to let some things go, and I want you to remember where you came from. She opened the envelope slowly, revealing dozens of old photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings. One picture caught her eye, a black and white snapshot of Eleanor sitting on the porch, reading a book with a rose in her hair. She smiled. I think I'll frame this one. Henry's voice cracked. She'd like that. Later, as the sun fell and the shadows grew long, Sophie stood on the porch with her suitcase. I'll come back soon, she promised. He hugged her tightly. Thank you, Sophie. You brought something back I thought I'd lost. What's that? She asked. Myself. She waved as she walked down the driveway, and he watched until she was gone. That night, Henry opened the Bible one last time, his fingers gently brushing the rose. It had chung yet it was drier, paler, but it was still there. Like her. He carefully took it out and placed it in a new box lined with velvet. A place of honor. Then, for the first time in 63 years, he turned past page 637. There were still so many psalms left to read. And he wasn't done living. The next morning, Henry stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the freshly trimmed garden. A robin landed on the fence, cocked its head at him, then flew away into the breeze. He ran a hand over the counter and stared at the empty teacup beside the sink. For years, it had just been part of the routine pour a second cup for Eleanor, even though she wasn't there to drink it. He would talk to her as though she were sitting at the table, just across from him. Now, something had shifted. Her presence hadn't faded, but its weight had changed. It wasn't the heavy ache of grief, Anna Maria, it was the quiet echo of love remembered. Henry picked up the phone. It rang 3 times before Lucy's familiar voice came through. Dad? Everything okay? He cleared his throat. Lucy, I think I'd like to visit Chicago. There was silence on the other end. Then a breath, sharp and surprised. Wait, are you serious? He smiled. Yes. I want to spend time with you and Sophie. Maybe even talk about something longer term. Dad, Lucy's voice broke. Do you know how long I've wanted to hear you say that? Henry blinked hard, throat tightening. I know. I just wasn't ready. But I think she'd want me to go. I think she sent Sophie to make sure I didn't spend the rest of my life in a house full of memories instead of making new ones. I'll come get you. This weekend. No tomorrow. He chuckled. Take your time. I'll start packing. After the call ended, he just stood there for a long while, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The stillness wasn't so lonely anymore. It was the kind of silence that followed peace, not pain. Later that day, he opened the attic. The last time he had climbed those creaky stairs, the dust had choked him before he even turned on the light. He'd left boxes untouched for decades-old photos, clothes, even the wedding dress Eleanor had insisted on keeping, just in case Sophie ever wanted to see it. He pulled the chain, and the bulb flickered on. Dust motes danced in the light. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, maybe closure, maybe something worth bringing with him. But then, tucked behind a stack of yellowed newspapers, he found the box. Her letters. Not from him to her, but from her to others. Letters to her mother, her sister, to Lucy when she was away at summer camp, even to herself. Eleanor had been a prolific writer, her way of processing the world. He opened one, written in elegant, flowing script. Dear me, you're going to be okay. Henry is hurting, but he's still here. Love sometimes looks like silence. Sometimes it waits for the right time to bloom again. Henry sat down on the old trunk and let the letter rest on his knee. Her words reached across time and memory and placed a hand on his shoulder. He gathered as many letters as he could and brought them downstairs. That night, he read them aloud, one by Onis, though Eleanor were in the room beside him, sipping tea and nodding along. When the last letter was read, he whispered, "Thank you, Ellie, for everything." The next morning, he called the local donation center. He set aside the things he no longer needed, the winter coats that hadn't been worn in years, the extra dishes, the books he knew he wouldn't reread. He kept only the essentials: the Bible, a few of Eleanor's letters, his favorite cardigan, a tin box filled with old photographs, and the rose now wrapped in silk tissue. As he stood at the door and looked back at the house for what might be the last time, he felt no fear, only gratitude. He had lived an entire life here. But now, something new was calling him forward. That weekend, Lucy arrived. She stepped out of the car, eyes wide with cautious joy, like she didn't quite believe he'd go through with it until she saw him standing on the porch, suitcase in hand. "You look good, Dad," she said. "You say that every time I'm wearing a clean shirt," he teased. She hugged him tightly. "You ready?" He turned to look at the garden one last time. The roses were in full bloom again, climbing the fence, brushing against the window Eleanor used to clean every Saturday morning. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." The drive was long, but it passed quickly, with Lucy and Sophie taking turns sharing stories, asking questions, and reminding Henry how the world had changed. QR codes, TikTok, electric cars. "I feel like I went to sleep in 1985 and woke up in the future," Henry joked. "You kind of did," Sophie laughed. When they reached Chicago, he was overwhelmed. The buildings, the traffic, the pace. But inside Lucy's quiet neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and neat sidewalks, he found a sense of calm. The guest room had been set up with care. Family photos on the dresser, a quilt that matched the one Eleanor had made for Sophie as a child, and a small vase on the nightstand with a single artificial rose. He smiled when he saw it. "Nice touch." Sophie grinned. "I thought Grandma might appreciate it." The first few weeks passed slowly. Henry took walks, read the newspaper on the porch, watched birds in the park, and started attending a local senior center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. At first, he kept mostly to himself, unsure how to connect after so long. But then he met Frank. Frank was 76, loud, bald, and had a laugh that could crack glass. He insisted Henry join the Thursday morning poetry circle, even if just to listen. "I didn't come here to read poems," Henry argued. Frank shrugged. "Neither did I. But then one day, I brought a poem my wife wrote, and it changed everything." Henry paused. "Your wife?" Frank nodded. "Passed 5 years ago, but she left behind a notebook. Her voice is still in those pages." Henry smiled faintly. "I know what you mean." By the third meeting, Henry brought one of Eleanor's letters. He cleared his throat and read it quietly. His voice wavered, but he made it through. When he looked up, the room was silent. Some of the others were wiping their eyes. "That's not just a letter," Frank said. "That's poetry." And something opened inside Henry. He began writing again, not letters, but short reflections, thoughts, memories. He wrote about the garden, About the day Eleanor danced barefoot in the grass. About the first time Lucy walked. About the sound of her laughter echoing off the walls. And when Sophie came home from college on weekends, she would sit beside him on the porch, listening as he read them aloud. "You should put these in a book," she said one evening. "Oh, no one would read it," he chuckled. "I would," she said, serious. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just his granddaughter, but the legacy of love passed down through generations. "I'll think about it," he said. One night in October, a storm rolled through. The wind howled against the windows. Henry stood by the kitchen sink, watching the rain. Sophie appeared beside him, her voice quiet. "Do you ever miss it? The house?" He nodded. "Of course, but I don't ache for it anymore." "You know what?" "Why?" "Because I brought her with me." Sophie slipped her hand into his. "She never really left." He smiled. "No, she didn't." That night, as he lay in bed, Henry reached for the box beside his bed and opened it. Inside was the rose, more fragile than ever, and a new letter, one he had written that day. He slipped it beneath the flower and closed the box gently. "Dear Ellie, you were right. The garden is in me, and now it's in them too. I finally turned the page, and I'm not afraid anymore. Forever. Henry." Henry adjusted quickly to the rhythms of city life, not because he embraced it, but because he began to understand something Eleanor had tried to teach him long ago. Peace was not found in the place, but in the presence you carried with you. Each morning, he rose early, made coffee the way she used, toast strong, but not bitter, and read from the Bible she had given him. The rose she had pressed inside now rested beside him in a velvet-lined box on the nightstand. He didn't open the box every day. He didn't need to. Its presence was enough. One Thursday afternoon at the senior center, the poetry circle letter, an elegant woman named Margot approached him with a proposal. "We're putting together an anthology," she said, her voice low and full of warmth. "We'd love to include one of your letters." Henry hesitated. "It's not really poetry." Margot smiled. "That's what makes it real. May I read it?" He handed her one of his pages, his favorite. It was about Eleanor's hands. When she finished, she blinked rapidly. "This needs to be in the world." Henry nodded, quiet. "Okay." In the days that followed, he started writing more. Not just letters to Eleanor, but letters to Lucy, to Sophie, to the future great-grandchild he might never meet. They poured from him like spring rain and rushed, sincere and utterly human. One evening, while Lucy cooked dinner, Sophie came into his room carrying an old shoebox. "Grandpa, look what I found in Mom's closet." She placed it on the bed. Henry opened it slowly. Inside were photos he hadn't seen in decades. Eleanor as a young woman, arms wrapped around Lucy on her high school graduation day. Notes written in Eleanor's looping handwriting. A lock of hair tied in a blue ribbon. And then, at the very bottom, a letter, addressed to him. His fingers trembled as he opened it. "My dearest Henry, if you're reading this, it means you're still walking through this life, and I'm so glad. I wrote this on a day when the wind smelled like lilac and the world felt like it was holding its breath. You were asleep in the chair by the garden, one hand still gripping the pruning shears, the other resting over your heart. I thought, maybe one day, when you're ready, you'll need my voice again. So here it is. You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible, not because of the house or the garden or the dinners with the neighbors, but because of your quiet kindness, your deep, steady love. The way you always knew when I was about to fall apart, and just held my hand until I didn't. I want you to forgive yourself for the things you didn't say, for the days when the world felt too loud and you stayed silent. Love was never measured in words. It was in the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. Take whatever time you have left and spend it living, Henry, not remembering. And when you feel lonely, look at Sophie. She has your steadiness. She has your soul. Don't you dare let your story end with my absence. You were always more than my husband. You were the roots. Love always. Eleanor." He folded the letter carefully and held it to his chest. The room blurred. The silence pressed in, not empty, but full. Later that night, after dinner, he handed the letter to Lucy and Sophie. They read it together, tears streaking both their faces. Sophie hugged him tighter than she ever had. "She really saw you," Lucy whispered. Henry nodded. "She always did." In the weeks that followed, Henry helped Lucy plant a new garden in their small backyard. It wasn't big, just a few rose bushes, some tulips, and marigolds. but he guided every step like he was writing a symphony. He taught Sophie how to prune the roses without harming their roots. He showed Lucy how to listen for the soil's needs. And on the first day a rose bloomed, bright red and defiant against the gray of a late autumn sky. He simply stood there and wept. One chilly November morning, Henry received a letter in the mail. It was from the senior center. Dear Henry, your story, The Hands That Held the Garden, has been selected as the opening piece for our winter anthology. We would be honored if you would read it aloud at the publishing event on December 10th. He stared at the letter for a long moment, heart pounding. Read aloud. In public. He hadn't spoken in front of a crowd since his wedding toast in 1960. That night, he asked Lucy, "What if my voice shakes?" She smiled. "Then they'll hear the truth in it." On the day of the event, he dressed carefully, pressed slacks, the navy sweater Eleanor had once knit for him, and a rose pinned gently to his lapel. Sophie drove him to the center, her hands steady on the wheel, the kind of quiet focus that reminded him so much of her grandmother at Hurt. When they arrived, the room was already filling. Seniors, volunteers, families. Henry saw Frank in the front row, giving him a thumbs up. When it was his turn, Henry walked slowly to the microphone. He unfolded the page with shaking hands. Then he took a deep breath. The Hands That Held the Garden, by Henry Whitaker. My wife's hands were not soft. They were soil-stained and weather-creased and beautiful. She never wore gloves when she worked with her roses. Said the earth needed to feel her pulse, and she needed to feel it back. She had this habit whenever something good happened, she would press her hands into mine like she was grounding it in my bones. When our daughter was born, when Sophie took her first steps, when the lilacs bloomed out of season, she pressed joy into me like seeds. Even in the end, when her breath came ragged, she found my hand, held it, pressed something into it one last time. And I believe it was hope. Because long after she left, long after the house quieted and the garden grew wild, I found that her hands had left something behind. Not just in soil or memory, but in the shape of who I had become. I was not just the man who lost her. I was the man she planted. When he finished, the room was still. Then someone stood, applauded, and the sound rose like wind through trees, like rain on a dry garden. Sophie had tears on her cheeks. Lucy had both hands over her mouth. Henry returned to his seat, heart pounding, and something in him shifted again. He wasn't a man who merely remembered. He was a man who had lived, loved, and now passed it on. That night, as they walked home beneath a sky dusted with stars, Sophie whispered, "I want to write, Grandpa." He looked at her, eyes shining. "Then you must. Will you help me?" "With everything I have left," he said. Back at the house, he opened the Bible again. The pages were worn now, soft from use. The rose was more fragile than ever. But he added a new item beneath it, the letter Eleanor had written to him. Two hearts, pressed together through time. The next morning, Sophie found him at the kitchen table, writing with his old fountain pen. "What are you working on?" He smiled. "A letter. To Grandma." "No," he said softly. "To you." She sat beside him and waited, not rushing him. "You're not going to be here forever, are you?" she asked. "No, love," he said, "but that's never been the point." She leaned her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that until the sun reached the window. And somewhere in the garden, a rose bloomed out of season. Winter in Chicago was unforgiving. The wind tore through the streets like a spirit searching for something lost, and Henry's bones ached in places he'd long forgotten. But inside Lucy's warm little house, surrounded by love and laughter, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in decades. There were nights when the memories would sneak up on him uninvited, but never unwelcome. He'd wake in the middle of the night and see the outline of the rose box on his nightstand. Some nights he opened it, gently brushing the tissue aside to see the faded petals. Some nights he only whispered Eleanor's name into the darkness, and that was enough. One morning in early February, Henry didn't come down for breakfast. Sophie knocked on his door. "Grandpa." No answer. She opened it slowly. He was sitting in his chair by the window, the Bible open on his lap, the rose pressed gently between its pages. A faint smile was still on his lips. His hand rested on a sealed envelope. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She walked to him, knelt beside him, and pressed her forehead to his shoulder. Her breath came in slow, steady waves. The kind you learn when love teaches you how to let go. Lucy found them like that, A few minutes later, her hand flying to her mouth before she sank to the floor beside them. He had left them peacefully, quietly, just as he had lived. Later that day, Sophie opened the letter he had left for her. Dear Sophie, if you're reading this, then I have finally gone to see your grandmother again. Do not be sad for me. I have lived a long, full life, and the best part of it has always been love. You gave me more time than I thought I'd have. Time not just to remember, but to grow. And that's what life is, sweetheart. It's not just a story you carry, it's a garden you tend. Some seasons are cruel, others bring bloom, but all of them matter. Write your words. Plant them where they can be found, even when no one is looking. I have left you something. You'll find it in the tin box. And know the Izumi roots are yours now. And through you, they'll keep reaching, with all the love this old heart could hold. Grandpa. In the tin box, alongside old photos and letters, was a smaller envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A title at the top, The Rose You Pressed Inside My Bible. It was the beginning of his memoir. Just the first page. Unfinished but not incomplete. I used to believe that grief was something you endured alone. That the world kept turning while you sat still, a ghost haunting the edges of your own life. But then a rose bloomed in winter, and I remembered what love could do. Sophie cried hard, the kind of sob that emptied a soul and made room for something new. Then she took a pen and turned the page over. She began to write. The funeral was small, intimate, just family, a few friends from the senior center, and Margot, who read aloud the letter Eleanor had once written to Henry. There wasn't a single moment without tears, and yet no one left feeling heavy. Henry had chosen to be buried beside Eleanor, just outside the city, under an old oak tree where sunlight pierced the branches in a gentle dance. They placed the Bible between his hands. Sophie tucked the rose back into its place. Roots, she whispered. We are your roots. Spring came earlier than usual that year. In the backyard, Sophie and Lucy watched as the garden began to stir. Buds pushed through the frost. The rose bush Henry had planted began to reach for the sky. One afternoon, Sophie called Lucy over with a shout. Mom, look. Among the green leaves bloomed a single red rose. Lucy knelt beside it. Her hand trembled as she touched the stem. He said it would bloom when we needed it. Sophie nodded, and he was right. Over the next year, Sophie poured herself into writing. The memoir became more than just Henry's story. It became a generational portrait of love, memory, loss, and renewal. She wove in Eleanor's letters, Henry's reflections, and her own voice a thread of youth and promise tying past to future. She called it The Rose You Pressed Inside My Bible, the same title her grandfather had given his first page. When the book was published, it carried a dedication. For those who taught me how to grow things in the dark. For Grandpa. For Eleanor. For love that outlives even the silence. Years later, in a quiet library in a small town, an elderly woman picked up a copy of the memoir. She turned to the first page, read a few lines, and paused. Then she smiled. Because she, too, had once pressed a rose into a book long ago. And now, someone had reminded her why. The end.